A community is all of the organisms of different species in a particular area that interact with one another and affect one another's fitness. But if you throw in the abiotic factors as well, things like sunshine and moisture and the types of rock that you find in the soil and the nutrients, all those things, along with the community, make up the ecosystem. And there are lots of weird ecosystems that can lead to weird life forms. For instance, in a glacier below Antarctica, there's no oxygen and no sunlight, and so you end up with this chemoautotrophic bacteria that's living off of particular chemicals and then producing iron. And so in rare instances, when that water is released to the air and sees oxygen, it turns this cool blood red. And the makeup of the abiotic factors are what dictate which kinds of biological organisms you're going to see there and lead to this really cool, what looks like a river of blood running out of a glacier. So a lot of what you do when you're studying ecosystem ecology is you look at nutrients and energy, and you look at the way that energy flows through an ecosystem and the way that nutrients cycle within an ecosystem. And this is all because the matter, those nutrients are made of matter, right? And energy, whether it be light energy or chemical energy or whatever else, they're subject to laws of physics. Specifically the laws of thermodynamics, and the first law of thermodynamics is the law of conservation of mass and energy. So it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Same with mass, which we'll talk about in a moment. And really, mass and energy are the same thing, and we know that thanks to Einstein, and that's why we can have nuclear bombs that make a lot of energy, etc., etc. But energy, in our case, enters an ecosystem typically as solar radiation, and then it's lost from organisms as heat. And the second law of thermodynamics states that every energy exchange increases to the entropy of the universe, which means the energy is going to become less and less ordered. And heat is a very disordered, it's the most disordered form of energy. And so ultimately, we lose energy as heat, it heads out into the universe, and that energy is gone. And if we didn't have new solar energy coming in, right, this second law of thermodynamics would mean that essentially the Earth would very quickly go to nothing, right? We would lose all life forms, and entropy would take over. But because we're an open system with lots of energy bombarding us from the sun, energy flows through the system and we're able to keep going. As I mentioned, that first law of thermodynamics is not just the law of conservation of energy, but it's also the law of conservation of mass. And matter cannot be created or destroyed either. And so chemical elements, which are matter, do not come or leave generally, with some small exceptions of things like asteroids, but generally they are recycled within ecosystems. So energy flows through an ecosystem. It may bounce around in there for a while, but eventually it leaves, and we need more energy to come in. It flows through, and chemical elements, nutrients, are recycled within an ecosystem. So in a forest ecosystem, nutrients will enter as dust, solutes in the rain. They will get carried away in water. And ecosystems are open systems, so we absorb energy and mass from around us, and we release heat and waste product. Generally, new energy is able to enter our ecosystems because of autotrophs. Autotrophs can build molecules themselves with energy from the sun using photosynthesis, or sometimes chemosynthesis if there's a chemical energy source, although most of those chemical energy sources are a result of sort of the energy of the Earth itself, in hydrothermal vents, things like that, which ultimately, will die out. Heterotrophs depend on autotrophs. They depend on someone else to synthesize these organic molecules, these little batteries that contain energy that used to be solar energy, so that we can survive. So generally, energy flows onto the Earth from the sun. It's harnessed by primary producers, and it moves up to primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Detritivores are also important, or decomposers, because they break down dead things, whether those dead things are producers or tertiary consumers, and they help to recycle those nutrients and also reuse whatever energy happened to be left in that body that didn't get radiated off as heat. And so this is what I meant when I said that energy flows through a system, but it can bounce through a system for a little while before it leaves. Detritivores help us to be more efficient at using that energy in a system, and also, again, help us recycle the nutrients. And as we talked about several chapters ago, those detritivores can be things like worms or nematodes, and bacteria are very important, but fungus are some of the most important detritivores in the world. And this is a look at that energy in visual form. Comes from the sun, moves through primary producers, consumers, secondary, tertiary consumers, etc. And eventually, through all of these stages, we lose some of that energy as heat, right? As we transform sugar energy into ATP energy, we lose that heat in between. As we use that ATP to do work inside of our cells or to move our muscles, we lose some of that as heat. So heat energy is lost all the way. And then when any of these organisms die, become detritus, detritivores recycle some of those calories while also losing some as heat themselves. Generally, when you ignore the few ecosystems that rely on chemoautotrophs, like those hydrothermal deep sea vents, in most ecosystems, primary production of that ecosystem is the amount of light energy from the sun that is converted into chemical energy by those autotrophs in a given period of time. And that primary production is what sets an ecosystem's energy budget. And that's why those producers, that producer trophic level is so very important for the structure of an ecosystem. And they are limited by the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's limits. Now, there's a lot of solar radiation reaching Earth's limits, but only a small fraction of it happens to strike photosynthetic organisms, and even less of that happens to be in a wavelength of light that is usable by those producers. So that total primary production, all of that solar energy that happens to get captured and turned into chemical energy by plants, is called gross primary production. That said, plants have to use some of that energy to live. Not just to build their bodies, but to do things like cellular respiration, to move things around in their cells, etc., etc. And so if you take that gross primary production and you get rid of the energy used for things like cellular respiration, what you have left is essentially what they put into their bodies, and that's net primary production. This is essentially what can move up the food chain. Another way to look at net primary productivity is just the amount of new biomass added in a given period of time. And the gross primary productivity is less relevant. It's only the net primary productivity that is available to consumers, to herbivores on up. And sometimes this is called the standing crop, the total biomass of photosynthetic autotrophs at a given time. And ecosystems can vary greatly in net primary productivity. A coral reef or a temperate broadleaf forest, for instance, or especially a tropical rainforest is going to have very high net primary productivity as compared to a desert. Tropical rainforests, estuaries, coral reefs, these are the most productive ecosystems per a particular unit area. Marine ecosystems are actually pretty unproductive per unit area, but because they're so huge, they actually contribute to a fair amount of the global net primary production. Here you can see a visualization of net primary productivity around the globe. Note, the Sahara Desert here, right, and the Arctic and Antarctic regions are pretty barren. Deserts in Australia. Note these big bright spots like the Brazilian rainforest or Peruvian rainforest, parts of Mexico, right, Borneo and Indonesia, and these areas here that are also around the equator. You get a lot of productivity. And in the ocean, you're relatively unproductive, but look at how big that ocean is. While net primary productivity is essentially just the biomass of the producers, net ecosystem production is a measure of the total biomass accumulated during a given period of everything, including consumers. So it's essentially gross primary production, all that energy that the producers are capturing, minus the cellular respiration of not just producers, but also consumers, of all organisms in an ecosystem. And you can estimate this by comparing the net flux of CO2 and O2 in an ecosystem. Right? How much O2 is being captured by photosynthesis, how much CO2 is being released by cellular respiration. A release of O2 is an indication that we're also storing CO2. Because primary production is so important for an ecosystem, whatever factor might be limiting that primary production is really important because it's limiting the entire ecosystem. And so in marine and freshwater ecosystems, the limiting factors could be nutrients, or it could also be light. We already talked about the photic and aphotic zones of lakes and oceans. This is the prime example of light limitation. So you tend to see most of the primary production in the ocean in that top level at the photic zone rather than below in the aphotic zone. That said, that's mostly a vertical stratification. In terms of geographic stratification and different primary production in different regions of the globe, rather than just in the depth of the water, nutrients are going to be the main difference there, right? And the limiting nutrient is whatever nutrient must be added to increase primary production in that area. Very often that's nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the limiting nutrients. Everything else you have enough of. While sunshine tends to be abundant at the top, nutrients are often abundant at the bottom of the ocean because things fall to the bottom. And so in areas where you have upwelling that brings nutrient-rich waters from the bottom to the top of the ocean where there's also light, well, then you have really, really high areas of productivity. You have upwellings like this in certain areas off the coast of California, the Central Coast. Additionally, if you have large amounts of nutrients that are being poured into lakes, added to lakes, beyond what's typical, that can have big ecological impacts. In a lot of areas, sewage runoff or agricultural runoff brings a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus into a body of water like a lake, and that leads to blooms of bacteria. And those bacteria will often use up when they die, and things eat them. Oxygen gets used up, and that kills off a lot of things in the lake. And this is called eutrophication of lakes. And we talked about this in an earlier chapter. But because these phosphates tend to be a big issue, very often now you'll go to Kroger to buy detergents, and some of them are labeled phosphate-free, and that can help avoid some of this kind of eutrophication of area water bodies. In terrestrial ecosystems, the limiting factors are usually temperature and moisture, although it depends where you are. As moisture increases, you tend to get more primary production. Obviously, moisture is less of an issue in the ocean or in a lake. But if you look at terrestrial ecosystems, as the mean annual precipitation goes up on this x-axis, the mean annual primary production tends to go up as well until you begin to see sort of a diminishing returns here at the top. One way to study this is to look at evapotranspiration, so water transpired by plants that evaporates out from the leaves from a landscape, and this is affected by precipitation, also temperature and solar energy, and it's a kind of a proxy for net primary production. Well, on a broad ecosystem scale, moisture and temperature tend to be limiting factors. On a very local scale, if you look at just a particular area, field or whatever, you might have a particular soil nutrient that could be the limiting factor. And most often that's going to be nitrogen. Sometimes it's going to be phosphorus as well in older soils. Because of this, a lot of mutualisms have evolved to overcome this barrier. A lot of plants have mutualisms with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We talked about legumes, for instance. A lot of plants have mutualisms with mycorrhizal fungi that help them gain access to water and minerals that they couldn't have access to otherwise. Roots tend to increase surface area in as many ways as possible, for instance, having root hairs. And a lot of plants have enzymes that they release that can help break down soil around them and release certain nutrients that may have been limiting. While primary productivity is the amount of solar energy, typically solar energy, that is converted into chemical energy, into plant bodies, essentially, in a given amount of time, secondary production is the amount of chemical energy, meaning existing animal bodies, that's converted into new biomass during a given period of time. So how much of that plant biomass, for instance, is converted into herbivore biomass, or how much of that herbivore biomass is converted into carnivore biomass.